Chapter 3. The Journey Home. Caleb squinted through the dirty fogged window of his room within the ship, as it glided away from a depressing and bleak view of the land. Against a backdrop of beautiful, rainy country billowed enormous tendrils of smoke rising from the fire of war, like thick black trees twisting and vining into the heavens. The fire mocked the departing victors as a testimony to thousands of lost lives of brothers and kinsmen, doused hopes of peace and the end of a long-lasting friendship. The terror of Talgarth was spreading from the Esterlands like a festering disease and infecting all that stood in its path. The tumult of war had ceased, and a serene yet gloomy calm moved in to replace it, making the moment seem like a cheerless painting. Caleb turned from the window. The tight space was occupied with a small bed, a quaint round table covered with maps and documents of battle, and a stool. His eyes moved to the stand on which his armor hung tired and beaten. The breastplate and guards for his shins and forearms hung on wooden poles with their straps hanging tiredly down, and the top of the stand was crowned with his great horned war helmet, looking like a strange apparition of himself staring from across the room. The empty face glared at him coldly, accusingly, fresh with the blood-stains of a former friend of Tritus. Caleb sat on the bed and slowly dropped his face into his hands. He tried to clear his mind and focus on his breathing as he slowly sifted the fresh echoes of war from his mind, and replaced them with thoughts of home. After a time most of the images of death and destruction vanished, but the face of King Roland remained, his wide eyes staring up at him as he slipped away. Caleb grappled between the torturous guilt searing his soul and his duty as a knight, now a captain. With each enemy he cut down, and even with each kingdom they crushed, he was further impeding the march of Talgarth across the sea. The weight of the guilt was winning the struggle. Why did they choose me? I am a mere captain of 30. There were countless others more capable than I. I will forever be the one who ended the Grimhall crisis with murder. The incapable son of Damon Rembrandt. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It swung open right away, making him jump to his feet. It was Anselm. He noticed Caleb's distress and studied him for a moment before stepping inside with a grimace. "Fate is still on our side, it would seem," he said with forced satisfaction. The dim candle light of the room cast odd shadows on his face. He had rid himself of his armor as soon as he was able, and the clasps of his warden robes were unfastened, revealing his tunic and pants underneath. Anselm let out a deep breath, and gave Caleb a light clap on the shoulder. "King Roland's end was not your fault, you know," he said, sensing Caleb's turmoil. "You should go up there with our men and drink to the health of Tritus." Caleb stood up and stretched. "I am all right, Ansel. I was just resting. You should give it a try sometime." "You weren't resting." Caleb chuckled and nodded. "What's done is done," he said, turning away to try to throw Anselm off the scent of his grief. "So what else was on your mind?" Anselm asked. There was something else. Now that the Battle of Grimhall had ceased, a battle of a different nature grasped his heart once again. Caleb reached into his pocket and felt the small, smooth ring at the bottom. The metal was warm as he bounced it between his fingers. He wasn't sure if this was the time or place to tell his closest friend what was on his mind. Anselm would certainly approve, but somehow the timing didn't feel right. He began anyway. "Well, actually Hold it," Anselm cut him off. "I know that face. You're going to say something really serious, aren't you? Well, if that's the case, we need to be up on the deck. The weather's a bit gloomy, but you could use some fresh air. So hold that thought and meet me up on deck at the mast in a few minutes, yes?" "Yes, all right." Caleb smiled again and shook his head at his eccentric comrade. "I'll be up soon." "Great. I've got to deliver my reports to Commander Arvis. If I don't get them to him by the time we make port, I'll be under the axe." Caleb wandered the creaking halls of the ship as it made its way smoothly south across the Fourth Sea toward home. He greeted the other men as he went, making sure to wear his stern but ever so friendly expression to keep their spirits up. The gloomy mood enveloping the men had not changed much since they left the castle of Grimhall in ruins. The usual pride that emanated from them after a victorious battle was not to be found. He met only sullen faces of doubt and regret. Caleb grimaced, wishing he could be off the creaking damp vessel more than ever. He eventually made his way to the front of the ship, to find Anselm leaning back in a chair with a small ink bottle in his lap, and scribbling fast in a worn old book, the one he always carried in his satchel in true warden fashion. Anselm claimed he disliked armor because of the extra weight, but his bound leather book looked heavier than any mailcoat. "You relentlessly write down every detail of every day's happenings, but I never see you go back and read them," Caleb said as he approached and leaned on the railing next to him. Anselm looked up and snorted. "It's the principle behind it, my friend. Come now, there have been plenty of times when my hexes have erased a good heap of my memory." He held the journal up. "And I was able to find what I lost in here. I read often." Caleb leaned over and inspected the pages. "I can't see how you can. It's been over 10 years since you came to Tritus, and nearly 8 since you began to learn to write, and your penmanship is still illegible. And you don't note the dates. Don't they teach you how to keep good records in warden training?" Anselm pulled the book away. "Quiet. I can find what I need when I need it just fine, it just takes a bit of time is all." "I've never seen your sister keeping her records either," Caleb pointed out. "The two of you truly are cut from the same cloth." "That's why Ella is such a fool," laughed Anselm. "That woman has poured so many memories into her work, she can't even remember her own name sometimes." They laughed. Caleb felt a glimmer of cheer talking with Anselm about something normal, but the sound of his laughter clashed oddly with the somber mood hanging thick in the air. Anselm's elder sister, Alastra Flitchett, was a mighty warden. So mighty, in fact, that her high-potency hexes had caused her major memory loss, as would be expected. She was far more of a zealot than Anselm, and didn't take the proper precautions and keep consistent records. The prices were high, but over the time Caleb had known her, she had grown very strong and acquired the title of Sage, the strongest of wardens who served just beneath the High Sage of Tritus. "Well, don't let me keep you. Write your notes on the day," Caleb said with a wave of his hand. "I'll finish later. Besides, you and Layla have been with me from the beginning of my training. You two are my backup memory. Anyway, what did you want to tell me?" Anselm slammed the book shut without marking his place and dropped it back into his satchel. He folded his arms and leaned further back in the chair. "I did not want to tell you," Caleb said, "but I was going to." He pulled the ring from his pocket and held it up. It was sparkling with silver, and the band curled softly to a point where a large red stone sat perched in the gold socket. His friend looked confused. "It was for Layla," Caleb said. He waited for Anselm to understand, and watched in amusement as it dawned on him. "For Layla? You mean you're going to ask her to?" "I thought so," Caleb sighed. "I had the ring crafted some time ago, months ago, though I am not entirely sure why." "Not sure why?" "Caleb, you two have been inseparable your whole lives. Everyone's always known it was coming, but frankly I was starting to doubt." "As am I," Caleb said, replacing the ring in his pocket. "Layla and I had our courtship, but things changed once I started serving Tritus as a knight. We did not see each other as often, and then the Gruul Wars began, followed by the Southern Rebellion. Now this with Grimhall, I just don't know where we stand anymore." He turned and leaned his elbows on the railing, looking out over the vast horizon of the Fourth Sea. He could see the small shadows of the gentle water dragons below the surface as they swam in a dance following the ship's wake. They were the closest creatures to the true dragons of legend, said to be living far in the great waste beyond the Esterlands and the Newland Channel, out and away from the hidden lands entirely, where no one ventured. Anselm moved to the railing as well, but fixed his gaze on the sea behind them, squinting at the disappearing kingdom of Celosia. "Grimhall," he said with a sigh. "We will see what that damned Queen Tamara says to this. She will see that Talgarth cannot march so freely on western shores." "Indeed," Caleb agreed. "They fell so easily. We sacked the castle in less than a day. They had no chance. What in fate's name did the Queen do to them? To King Rawlin? It is as though the unity and valor of the place was bled right out of its foundations. Who knows? That woman is mad. Only fate can tell what ungodly schemes she placed to ensnare them. I for one would rather be left in ignorance. But she gets what she desires. It's no wonder they call her the Lioness." They stood in silence and squinted out over the churning sea. Grey rain clouds gathered in from the horizon, seeming to creep up behind them. There was no mistake that Talgarth, led by the Queen Tamara the Lioness, was openly hostile to all nations in the Hidden Lands. The small country had turned hostile abruptly some 30 years earlier, and armies of men and ghouls flocked to it over the years. Before anyone noticed, Talgarth had become a dangerous nation to be reckoned with. Her influence was strong in the Esterlands, proving that the rumors had to be true. She possessed one of the ancient sister blades. The weapon crafted by fate that legend said was the first weapon to have ever taken a life on the earth. Queen Tamara's reputation spread across the seas as she burned her way through the cities of the Esterlands, stretching her influence to what could soon grow to be an empire rapidly southward. Her brutality and lack of mercy were known far and wide through the accounts of her campaigns. She was unmatchable with her skill of war and strategy, but her beauty and the icy pierce of her gaze alone was enough to fell any foe. She took true joy in tearing asunder all that was good, innocent, or right. She slew women and children, keeping their limbs as trophies of her prowess. Or so they said. The Lioness was a woman that haunted the dreams of grown men. The Esterlands were wild, mysterious lands across the Fourth Sea, and the doings of Talgarth had never concerned the affairs of Tritus. Not until Grimhall had been drawn into it. The ship sailed on all through the following day. When Caleb walked back out onto the deck early the next morning, he could see the shores of home with the high grey spires of the Titan Mountains protruding out from the morning haze. The Titan Mountains encircled the city of Tritus itself like a cradling arm, shielding them from any attacks that could be launched from the Fourth Sea, providing a sturdy backdrop for further defense measures. The mountain range also offered a network of deep mines, allowing the craftsmen of the kingdom to forge heavy armor and weapons. Tritus was a strong country inhabited by strong people both of will and physical strength. The massive warships came into port at Hammer's Bay, a settlement of fair size that managed the traffic of all of the vessels of the Kingdom of Avondale. As they came to a stop at the docks, a horde of well-built men stormed about them, tying them ashore with thick steel cords. One by one, they pulled the doors inside and set up an array of ramps and portable staircases, allowing the passengers to disembark. Caleb and Anselm stepped out into the sunlight in a group of 25 war chiefs. Of all of the commanders, generals and captains that had set out to Grimhall, only 2 had been slain and just 6 others injured. Truly a miraculous victory. It had been so easy. They made their way down the ramps, holding their helmets under their arms as they descended into the chaotic swarm of cheering people below. They were met by a mixture of sailors and harbor men attending to their duties, locals come to see the heroes, and soldiers trying to keep order. The lot of them were only a shadow of the parade that awaited them once they reached the city that afternoon. Commander Arvis walked ahead of Caleb and Anselm. Long had he served the king, and by no turn of chance had become Caleb's mentor when Caleb began his service 11 years before. Commander Arvis was a longtime friend of his father, and like many praised him for the great hero he was, a fact that gave Caleb not a little difficulty, as the legend of Damon Rembrandt, the possessor of the hallowed blade and slayer of the dark sage, was a difficult one to live up to. The hallowed blade was said to have been created by fate himself, deep in the heartlands where mankind had its beginnings. Despite the efforts of his father to reduce the knowledge of the famous blade to myth and rumor, too many reliable people still knew he had it, and revived the stories back to truth, Commander Arvis being one of the primary culprits. His father had possessed the sword since before Caleb was born. He had talked about it on occasion, of victories he had won with it while in the service of the king. Growing up, Caleb had known it was some sort of relic of ancient importance, but years later he understood the gravity of what lay hidden in a box under his father's bedroom floor. His father was not shy to speak of it, although when he did he always seemed to do so with a sort of sad nostalgia. His eyes would grow heavy as he spoke, as if he were looking into the past through a dark tunnel. Naturally, Caleb thought it was a relic that represented his young life, and learned not to ask him too much about it. And besides, he was not interested. As they walked, Caleb heard a few men ahead of him talking amidst the cheers of the crowd about Talgarth and their wars with the Shadow Walker shapeshifters and other beasts that had strayed from the uncharted waste. Caleb lacked the energy to listen. They waved and smiled as they made their ways through the crowd at the bottom of the ramps. It didn't take long for the band of warriors to climb into their carriages and speed off toward the city. The footmen were to march back once they regrouped at the bay. The ride to the city was a short one at full speed, but for all the valiant soldiers who had come home from war, it seemed like an eternity. Caleb watched the tall green grass fly by from the window of his carriage. Thin grey clouds had veiled the sun, but somehow they seemed less threatening than before. Tritus welcomed them back. At last the city came into view. Far down the dirt road in the distance, it sat nestled against the mountainside in all of its glory. It stretched like a blanket in the grass, and a white wall encircled the whole city, hiding everything inside but the tallest spires of the outer towers and a few taller buildings. Behind the spires and steady smoke streams that rose from the chimneys, the castle sat at the very back of the city, nearly carved into the mountainside, watching over the land like an aged grandparent. As they drew near, the sounds of trumpets blew, and the mammoth gates of the city of Tritus creaked open. Inside, a thick crowd of shouting townspeople thronged about, with a lane carved down the middle of them for the carriages to pass through and make their way to the castle keep. In their rumbling carriage, Commander Arvus slapped Anselm's knee and gruffly commanded that they let the crowd see the heroes' faces. Strapping their swords to their belts and replacing their helmets, they one by one hopped out of the slow-moving carriage as it went on, each new victor eliciting louder cheers from the crowd. They walked by the side of the vehicles, waving and nodding. Caleb could not help but smile at the gracious cheers and praises, but it sounded different from their return from the Gruul Wars or the Southern Rebellion. The cheers seemed heavy with doubt. He scanned the crowd for his father, who was sure to be there, and Layla too, along with her parents and brothers, but he couldn't find them before the procession ended, and they continued their march through the royal gates onto the castle grounds.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.